by now, I cannot believe you guys don't know about Alphadraft, this company that offers this great fantasy esports service. If so, what were you doing? Because Alphadraft have absolutely destroyed the competition within this particular field. They offer all types of contests in all types of games: CSGO, Dota 2, League of Legends, Smite, all levels of contest, all different types in terms of small ones, decent ones, large ones, like the amounts of Skrilla they shove into my pocket, making me look like some kind of cartoon bandit with a massive sack with a dollar sign on it and a stripy shirt. But actually, I'm not wearing a stripy shirt. I'm wearing a jersey because I'm trying to be all professional now that I'm on camera. And yes, the people who choose me to be on camera are aware that this is the dress code. So that's alphadraft.com. In the description box below, Skrilla. Now then, there was an interesting interview published the other day with Deman, legendary League of Legends caster, and more recently this year doing CSGO with ESL, who he works for full time now, where he made a comment in it that he regretted leaving Riot and doing League of Legends essentially. And the problem with this is because he's coming from League of Legends into CSGO, and now he's in CSGO, and it's kind of like mildly contentious in terms of how accepted he's been or how much people want him to do certain events. Obviously people are looking for like anything that might be said about whether you like this game or like that game, and so people interpreted his statement about regretting leaving as something that means, you know, he regrets actually doing CSGO. And so then people got really upset by this. So I wanted to actually make a video addressing that topic, and then as a broader topic within that, there's obviously subtopics that are about time he has spent in CSGO, the problems of becoming a caster there, what might have been the issues, and I think it's something in general we can talk about. So first and foremost, the details of what happened. Deman was a caster for Riot for a couple of years in the LCS, and on the 28th of November in 2014, last year, it was announced that he would be leaving Riot and that he would join ESL full-time, and then he would be working for ESL, not Riot anymore, not as an LCS caster. And part of the reason for this was that the studio that the EU LCS is casted from, instead of being in Cologne, where he's based, would be moving to Berlin, which is quite far away within Germany. You can't just travel there by car very easily, as far as I know. You'd probably need a flight or something. And on top of that, there was possible contract issues. And then, as another reason also, his girlfriend at the time, who's Pansy, who's an ESL cast, this is all stuff that he's publicly stated himself, by the way. I even double-checked all this, so it wasn't speaking out of school or anything. Because, for example, because she is based in Cologne, working for ESL, obviously if he moves to Berlin and he's reasonably far away, or he has issues with commuting, it's going to make it more difficult just to live your everyday life. So quite a reasonable, understandable detail to mention, right? So first and foremost, again, that's not speaking out of school. In an AMA 10 months ago, someone said, how long have you and Pansy been going out? And he said, around 19 months or so. Now, people have implied within the latest threads, such as the League of Legends one of the top comments, that he's no longer with Pansy, and so that must be why he's now more interested in thinking back on, like, should I have gone to Berlin? Should I have moved? Should I have stayed here for these reasons? So, okay, again, that's also entirely reasonable. As your circumstances change, you will reflect back on the past differently, and even what you want to do in the future, because obviously you might not be tied down by the same certain things, or you might have not have the same things motivating you to make a certain decision. We all have external pressures, and we all have our own internally driven reasons for doing things that might not always, from an observer that doesn't know the details, seem as logical or the way they should be done. Now, here's some of the actual details of what he said himself. So in the same AMA 10 months ago, someone asked him, was your decision to leave Riot influenced by the move to Berlin? And would he still be a Riot caster if LCS has stayed in Cologne? And he says 100% yes. And then when someone asks him to expand on that, he actually says, let's see, back before, okay, so he basically says he was based in Cologne, and that when the Berlin move was announced, there was very little reason as to why it was announced, except just the PR reason that everyone had heard. And he said that's fine, you have to accept these decisions are outside of your hands, but that he was settled in Cologne, and that moving to Berlin meant uprooting everything once again, which he'd done 2 years ago when he'd moved from the UK to Cologne, and so he was quite hesitant about that. And so initially he asked them if he could stay in Cologne, just commute to Berlin weekly, because obviously it's only a couple of days, the ELCS. But first of all, that wasn't an option in terms of what Riot wanted to happen. And also, he mentions that his full-time contract with them as a full-time employee was going to be like voided, and instead he would be given a temporary contract just for a few months. Then on top of that, he heard that they'd be bringing in new talent, which he would be expected to train up to some degree. So, I mean, you can understand here, if he's got a temporary contract, he hears they're bringing in new people. Oh, can you help train them up? It makes it sound like, right, well, if they like how that goes after a few months, maybe there's an issue for you. If you're the one having to commute and have extra expenditures for a company, they're going to be thinking, is there a way we can cut back on that? I can understand here why he would at least consider other options. And so he did. He went over to talk to ESL, he talked to them, they decided to bring him on full time. He moved over to ESL and the whole Riot LCS thing was done. And obviously you could still do League of Legends anyway because IEM have their own events. So first and foremost, I mean, to me, those are totally reasonable, not even demands, that totally reasonable circumstances from which to make that sort of a decision. I can entirely understand that. Obviously, later on, when we see how it's gone in CSGO, you could say, maybe some of it was a mistake, or maybe there was a different way to go about it. But now that you know the backstory there, you can look at what he said in this interview. So in the interview, the question, and this is an ESL website interview, it's not someone else even, so it's not like you can imply the question was twisted or anything. It says, you were, and to many still are, one of the faces of professional League of Legends casting. Was it difficult to end the Riot chapter in your life and begin a new one focused on CSGO? Deman says, yes, it was very difficult and honestly something I regret doing. I made choices based off my personal life at the time and it turned out to be the wrong decision. However, casting CSGO and the multitude of other games I do for ESL have their own challenge, which I am happy to face. Now, obviously people jumped on this and they just took the first part and they took the fact he said he regretted and the fact that he's left League of Legends what he regrets and the fact he's doing CSGO, and they drew these like quite drastic implications from it along the lines of like almost as though he was ungrateful, or as a result, why should he be allowed to do the majors in CSGO if he's this guy who regrets it, you know. Now, first of all, it's quite clear his sentiment here, the way I read it, is that what he regrets is leaving League of Legends, which was a game he was very loved in, he was one of the best in, he had entire respect throughout the industry, and it was in a great place in his life, and he clearly loved doing League of Legends. Now, he says at the time, you know, he made this decision of personal decisions, which you can understand. Now, whether he regrets it himself, I mean, a lot of us regret things once they're over or once they're in the past and think, I wish I'd done it differently. But at the time, I think it's entirely fair that he made the decision he did, and I think it probably even makes sense, especially when you have casted a game for so long, maybe you even won a new challenge at the time. That's the way people often think. So, okay, nothing unusual so far. And then he even goes ahead and says, like, you know, casting CSGO and other games have their own challenges, as in it's not easy, but he's happy to face them. It's not like he says here, and I especially regret it because it meant I had to cast CSGO, which is not a game that I like doing as well, or I don't feel I'm good at, or I'm not being accepted. So he didn't say any of that. In fact, he said it's a challenge, but he's happy to face it. So he's actually happy to be doing CSGO. That's the way you have to interpret things based on what people said. Yes, you can draw implications, but at the moment it feels like people are reading between the lines where there's nothing to read there, and they're in fact purposely skewing it. Now, with that said, he got a little bit upset by this, and on Twitter he said, I say I regret leaving LCS. CS Reddit twists it to say I regret doing CS. You could be politicians the way you twist words. Now, first of all, I mean, while I understand what he's upset about there, which is that they've twisted it as though basically they've made it as though the main comment was I regret doing CS, whereas that's the other way around. The main comment is I regret leaving Riot/League of Legends, and then as a very minor indirect implication, yes, he regrets doing CS in as much as if it was CS or League, then now knowing what he knows now, maybe he would have chosen the original decision and not made such a drastic alteration in his career. That's not the same as saying he regrets CS, or he doesn't like CS, or he doesn't value CS, or CS isn't as good to him right now. But to be fair to the people criticizing, obviously to some very minor degree, bearing in mind the option was LCS and League of Legends or CSGO within ESL. Obviously, you could have done other games, but CSGO is going to be one of the main ones. To some very minor degree, you are saying you do regret doing CS, but only in the context of you could have done League of Legends and not moved, or rather had moved and maybe not made mistakes, whatever personal issues you have going on. But you've got to be reasonable on that. There is a degree to which you're saying the best thing to stress there and emphasize is that obviously you're not really regretting CS as in you don't have anything against the game. It's nothing to do with that. It's just some certain career stuff in the past which has led to a position where you do CS now and not League of Legends. I also think, if we're being fair, that the big thing that is missing in this whole debate in terms of what's going on here is that if you look at his original explanation, which I spoke from his AMA, read out, he gives the main reasons there to do with like the contract, moving, and the training up the new casters. He doesn't really mention the personal issue there, which is on the, you're not obliged to. But then after the fact, he now mentions it primarily just for the personal reason. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because the priorities seem to have changed here, or the main reason he's telling himself and other people as to why he did it seems to have changed, as though he's like retconned the past as to what really was the reason he did that, or maybe he's just thought back now and thought this is the main reason I did it, even if I thought at the time I was doing it or I publicly said that. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I actually think there's another factor involved in this also, which is that the way he's been received in CSGO is not to the same degree as in League of Legends, and I think that has to play some part in your own personal motivation, in where you see the career going. You see CSGO getting big, but you're only working for ESL and you're not doing other events. You see League of Legends still massive and people doing the World Championship. And hey, I understand if you were a caster and you saw someone doing the World Championship finals on the Riot broadcast and everything's going crazy, and that's where you used to be and used to be a main person, I can see why you'd think, oh, I could still be doing that. Now that my personal issue that made me not want to move has gone, I mean, what is stopping me doing that now? And if in CSGO I'm not getting the reception I want, this is all entirely reasonable. But I think it leads into the issue of what did happen to Deman in CSGO. What were the issues? So we can address this and we can kind of get to the bottom of how he's gotten to this place in his career where unfortunately he regrets the way things have gone. And, well, we don't know, but possibly wonders if they could go that way again in the future. And maybe there is uncertainty right now, or maybe he'll stay being a CSGO caster. So let's talk about this as a topic. Now, first and foremost, let's just say, in terms of League of Legends, I don't think it's even really debatable what the guy said there. I mean, I wouldn't say one of the faces. I'd said he's one of the voices of League of Legends. I think it's almost certain that he was. I mean, the main voice of League of Legends probably was Joe Miller, but I'd say the main two was Joe Miller and Rivington. Obviously, they did different leagues. One was EULCS, one was NALCS. But right after that, to me, the next two names is Deman and Jat, and these are the original guys who were around then. Yes, someone like Monty might be fantastic, but first of all, he's a colour commentator anyway, I guess Jat is as well. But he's doing a league that's not going to be watched by as many as UNL and LCS, and they also did a lot of the open circuit, so yeah, he's absolutely one of the voices of the game, one of the most beloved casters ever in esports history, and certainly in League of Legends. Well, primarily in League of Legends, if we're being real. So, when he came to ESL, the immediate issue was that Joe Miller also had left Riot. And so both of them have left. Both of them have joined ESL full-time. I mean, technically, as far as I know, it's something like Joe Miller did EULCS, but I think it was something along the lines of that he still worked through ESL somehow. I'm not quite sure the certain circumstance, but he'd obviously been at ESL a long time anyway. Because I mean, he was at ESL when I casted with him at 1.6 back in like 2010. So he's been around ESL a long time. Now, what happened was the jobs that they got was Deman was quite quickly put into casting CSGO, and that was clearly going to be a main thing that he was going to be doing over the year, along with other games, while Joe was promoted to, I think the title was like Director of Content at ESL TV, which, by the way, is a position he entirely deserves. He worked there many, many years. He has a lot of experience knowing who to work with and all the rest of it, so it makes sense that he would. The unfortunate part about that, though, is that looking in as an observer on the outside, I even said this at the time myself, if you could have designed the system, ideally, you would actually want it to be Joe that is going to be the full-time CSGO caster if you could, because even though he hasn't done CS for like a year and a half at that point in time, he's an extremely loved. He was the voice of CS 1.6, and so I think he would have a much bigger advantage coming back into CSGO where people would be incredibly receptive, and he had a really good start. Meanwhile, for Deman, I think it would have made more sense to keep him primarily on the League of Legends tournaments, although I admit at that point in time I'm not sure how that would work. It maybe bring him in on more of a minor level in CSGO, keep him doing all the League of Legends stuff, and then gradually try and build it up. I'm not sure how you do it exactly, but that seems like a more logical way, because between the two of them, yes, both were super big in League of Legends, but Joe Miller would obviously be a lot better received initially. In fact, to this day, people still call for him to do CSGO, and he hasn't done big tournaments in a long time, and now he's only just started to gradually get into it again with the odd match recently. So one of the main issues that I see with Deman's entry into CSGO is that, if you remember, it was in, I think, let me see, wasn't it November I had there? Yeah, it was in late November that he left Riot, and yet the first major of 2015 was in March. It was ESL 1 Katowice, and boom, he's right in there doing majors and doing big matches. Now, the problem there immediately is going to be that there's no build-up. People didn't see you at other tournaments. People didn't get used to you. People didn't ask for you to be doing the major. People didn't start to build a hype where they think, oh, this person should be and all these things. Now, this has nothing to do with me. This is the way this is the way you're perceived in public. This is the public opinion, public consensus on you as a person and as a caster. So the issue there is when you're just inserted in there by a company, then people are going to start to think like, oh, why is this guy doing it? Or who is this guy? Or people who don't know you from League of Legends, they're going to have no basis even to be like, oh, I'm sure he's a cool caster. If he gets up to speed, he'll be good. They won't have any of that. Some of these people, in fact, a decent amount of our big CSGOs game, will just be experiencing you for the first time. So when you're on the biggest stage, any small mistakes you make will be magnified. Naturally so. This is the way it would be. This is exactly what you'd expect in that particular sense. And actually, from seeing Deman's personality and seeing some of the other things that have gone on Twitter and other comments in the past, he's the sort of person where if he was an expert in a game and he was he was a big figure within a game and he'd spent a lot of years and he had a lot of the skills to do it and he'd done a lot of events and had earned his way up in League of Legends, if someone else made certain comments on publicly on Twitter or in a thread or maybe even in a game, he himself wouldn't be averse to calling the person out or making a comment, etc. I mean, that's just his personality. So this is what's going to happen to you as well if you're on the biggest stage like this. There's then also the whole political drama that went down where it was initially announced that like Anders wouldn't be doing the final of that major, even though Anders it literally is the voice of CSGO. Then there was the drama of suddenly Deman's not doing it, and in the end, there was a TriCast for the final, which was Anders, Tosspot, and Sean Gares. Now, Deman himself made some tweets where he seemed upset about this. Now, he later on said that this was just because he wouldn't get to be in the Spodek and he had to go and do this, I think it was like Intel Challenge Cup. It was like a women's tournament final instead of doing the male one. And understandably, you'd be annoyed if you couldn't be in this huge stadium with loads of fans watching like an epic final and you've just moved over to CSGO. So you're thinking, right, I'm going to give this a good go and I'm not going to get to do the final. It makes sense personally why he would be upset over that. The problem is, that's not entirely the full story as far as I'm aware. Like, based on things I've heard, there was some back and forth of whether or not he could do the final and whether he wanted to do the final, and then things just ended up being resolved in that way, and it was implied that he had at least, if not some say in who did the final and who did these matches, some direct influence over it, and it was certainly being pushed to initially do these things and to be a huge part of the CSGO thing and branded as a CSGO caster. So I'm not sure that's entirely... I think it's kind of a little bit disingenuous the way that was presented, but okay, whatever. So he didn't do the final, problem solved, keep moving on. But that clearly put in place the concept that he might be put into a finals type situation, despite the fact he's a brand new caster to CSGO. You then move forwards, and by the way, I may as well clarify, when I say about having some influence, now having direct say over it, it's very rare big casters do that unless they work for the company within the hierarchy, like Joe Miller. But big casters do have influence over which games they get to do. Some of them can complain about something or ask for it to be shifted around, and I've seen it happen before. If you're a big enough name, if you have enough big enough influence and carry enough weight, you can have some influence over these things. Problem here is his influence in casting stuff comes from our past game. It's not from CSGO. It's not that he is the name where all the fans have to see him and that's where he gets the leverage from. It's from being within ESL as far as we know. Now, when it came to the next major, the one that was in August, so ESL 1 Cologne, he did do the final of that as part of a TriCast. The TriCaster was Anders, who did the previous one, Henry G, who was like the player / color commentator part of the TriCast, and then Deman. Now, can you see the problem that's arising with these two finals? I mentioned Semler once, have I? So Semler didn't do the Katowice final, and he didn't do the Cologne final. Now, the issue here, quite simply, is that Anders and Semler are the voices of CSGO. They are to CSGO what people like Rivington, Joe Miller, Deman were to League of Legends. So just as those people should be primary considerations to do the final of like a World Championship of League of Legends, Anders and Semler should be the first choices to do major finals. Now, Anders does the Katowice one, after there was some debate there. Semler doesn't. And then Semler doesn't get to do the Cologne one, even though he's right there at the event, and he's been doing casting at the event, but Deman's doing it. So you see the problem there. You can't just judge it as Deman was put in the final and judge how he did. Unfortunately, you have to judge it as who else might have been there, what would the contrast have been like, who should have been picked one over the other. And I can't really make a case, aside from it's an ESL company, they hire Deman, they want him to be in the final, perhaps, over why you would pick Deman over Semler. Now, to me, that's kind of bullshit. Like, I mean, people always say Like, oh, can't Anderson Semmler do every event? Do they? Fuck. I mean, there's only been 7 majors, right? And off the top of my head, I think they've only cast the final of like 3 of them or something crazy like that. Like 3 out of the 7 is what I think they've cast the final of. I think that's correct, actually. Which is absolutely ludicrous in my book. If they're the premier casting duo and they are the voice and all this, go look at Artosis and Tasus, go look at Deman, Joe Miller, these sorts of people. They're doing tons of these massive ones because they are the voice of it. So in that sense, you're now not only putting yourself up there on the biggest stage, which you're doing anyway by being in the final of the major, but you're now contrasting yourself directly with Semmler, because that's what's happening by you taking what would be his spot otherwise. I realise to people inside the business that might sound like a childish way to think about it, but that is the way the public are going to think about it. That's what's going to happen. You have to be realistic about this. Now, I actually think one of his biggest problems in terms of winning over the CSGO public was exactly this. The fact that to the public, it felt like, even though, yes, he did some online matches and he did other ESL tournaments, it felt like he was inserted directly into majors and now, in this sense, into finals after not very long in the game. Less than a year within the game, only a few months within the game in terms of being put into majors. Now, yeah, if you're going to be put into majors, that's one thing, but I actually feel like if you look at the way the rest of the scene works and the way people build their way up, there's a storybook to how people get to majors and how they get to these points where with most other people, it's quite difficult in general for them to be hired unless it's just because a company inserts them and the public to really hate it. Because usually what the other companies are doing is trying to take the temperature of the company. The public likes this guy and think this guy's good, and people really love this guy. We need this smaller event. Let's give him a try at as the secondary or third tier caster, and if he does well, he works his way up. There's a logic to the rest of how it works. The problem here is when you're getting sort of artificially put in by a company, well then since it's artificial, there's no ground swelling for that. There's no grassroots people of yeah, we got to have this guy in. So you're going to be running into problems immediately. There's then the issue, which is something people have debated many times back and forwards, is did he do his homework? Did he actually do enough casting practice? Did he learn enough about the game? Did he do X, Y, and Z? Now, first of all, I don't even know if you could in 8 months actually, bearing in mind this is when he did the major final, I don't even know if you could within 8 months actually learn enough to be really good at CSGO, as in be as good as Anders and Semmler, who are the people you might be replacing in these scenarios. That's the issue. Now, you could definitely be a second or third tier caster, I think, because I've seen, for example, Sadakist. He's a guy who, when he did his first international event, which for me was MLG Aspen. I mean, I know he'd done ESEAs before, but when he did that event, at that point in time, yeah, he knew a bit about the Europeans, but he was still mainly an NA caster. And I noticed he put in a lot of work over the year and he got really good at the European stuff. So I've seen him advance a lot within a similar time period. So I think it is possible, but not if you want to be number one. I mean, it makes sense. Think logically. What if not me, but let's say someone who's a really good caster from CSGO. Let's say Anders switched over to League of Legends tomorrow. And let's say he had a minor background. He might play a bit of League of Legends. And tomorrow he starts in League of Legends. And Deman is over in League of Legends in this example, okay. So Deman's number one and Anders starts to learn. And let's say he does do his homework. Let's say he goes really ham for 8 months. And then in 8 months, we have a huge final. Let's say World's final. And I take out Deman, who was a fan favourite, and I put in Anders. In that scenario, even if Anders was very good over those 8 months, odds are he wouldn't be as good as Deman, wouldn't be as polished, wouldn't have all the experience of that particular game. And the fans wouldn't like it as much. It's entirely reasonable. So how it can not be understood the other way around, it's just a little bit puzzling to me and seems a little bit... I mean, it almost seems a little bit deluded to imagine it wouldn't be that way in many ways. Now, personally, I won't comment on whether he did his homework or not. It's difficult to know. If someone says they did, unless you have some compelling evidence otherwise, or some great examples of mistakes they made. I mean, I saw some mistakes, but they were reasonably minor ones. It has been rumoured, I mean, I think Richard might have said as much on By the Numbers, that he didn't do that much of his homework, or he didn't put in as much work as Joe, for example. I can't remember if he said something along those lines, but whatever, ultimately that's hearsay. At the end of the day, people can judge what they see on the camera and hear on the camera. They don't need to know what he actually did. If you do a good job anyway, that might not even matter that much. Now, to me, that is less important, whether he did the homework, than whether he earned his spot. Now, I will just point out that I know Deman himself didn't directly say this, at least I've never found an interview where he said it, but I think it was implied by many people when he came into the game, and he himself said similar things, where he would always say when he was coming into CSGO, along the lines of I originally was an FPS caster, because as far as I know he did Call of Duty and possibly... I'm not sure if he did enemy territory. I know he did Call of Duty. Because he was originally an FPS caster, I know he did Battlefield 1942, I think. because he was originally an FPS caster, it was implied that, right, well, he was an FPS caster originally, as though he has like a base within the CS type genre, and maybe he's even done some CS back in the day. I mean, we're talking about 2005, 2006, presumably sort of era, if he'd done any like UK lands or something. And so maybe that's going to give him a basis. Now, first and foremost, if he ever thought that, or any fan ever thought that, that's incredibly naive. That's absolutely irrelevant to being a CSGO caster now. You may as well be starting fresh with nothing if you're going to come into the game in that sense. And the reason I say that is because aside from some very simple technical skills of how to do an FPS game, you're not going to have really any knowledge whatsoever or any basis within the game. I mean, Call of Duty is very different from CSGO. CSGO is very different from the old version of CS. CSGO now, in terms of the tactics and how the game works and how you even do the casting within the game, is entirely different. Like when people talk about those really old school guys like DJ Wheat, Red Eye, Tosspot, those guys, if you transport them from 2005 to now, would be terrible casters. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of casting back then was you were really just hired from one company, whatever company that might be, to do events. And at the event, you might do more than one game, or you might do a totally different game to the one you normally do. So your skills there were general skills. They were how to work on a mic and how to not stumble and how to sound good with a good casting voice and how to do very basic stuff like keep the flow of a cast going and how to interact very simply with the color commentator and bring them into them. And at that point in time, you don't need to know anything about the game. It might be very minimal. But casting's moved on a lot from then. There's a reason why the best casters are all game specific at the moment within esports. And that's exactly why, because there's a lot of nuance to each game even you have to build up and learn, as Deman did in League of Legends. That's why he became a phenomenal League of Legends play-by-play caster. Now then, let me see, he even says when he comes into the game that he had played a ton of 1.6, and he said that he'd watched every major and semi-major CSGO tournament, but he acknowledges that, his player and game knowledge will take some time, and you don't learn that over just a few months of playing and watching, even though actually he was doing a major within a few months of playing and watching. In this sense, I mean, I guess he wasn't as much, he says he's watched all the previous ones, but at least in terms of doing the job, he even says it only comes from actually doing the job. And then he even says, I'm well aware of how communities react, as I've had to win over the Call of Duty and League of Legends communities before. Now that part makes sense. He has won over those communities, and obviously League of Legends is a very different game to Call of Duty. It's not an FPS game. So I wonder if that's also part of the problem, that he felt as though, right, well, I did it before, I won them over before, if I come in, it's going to work again, I'll get CSGO, like I'll win people over, people see how good I am technically, I'll work my way up in the knowledge, it should all be great. Now here's the issue. I want to have a discussion now about casting, and this is mainly going to be like to enlighten people who are just people who listen and maybe don't think about how it breaks down. So I would break down casting for the purpose of this particular explanation. There'll be a model that includes 3 categories. Category 1, I'm going to call technical skill. And by that, I mean when you're on camera, are you presentable? Can you express certain emotions? Can you use illustrations? Can you come across in an amiable way? Do you have talent in terms of you're not nervous? You don't look up and down all the time or whatever it might be. You're just on camera, you're good. You have a good on-camera personality. Then there's technical skill on the mic. I mean, to use like a rapping term, what is your flow like? What is your cadence like? What is the pacing like of what you do? What is your dictionary of words like? Do you get stuck in the same things? Do you get stuck with the same catchphrases? Can you interact well with someone else like that? All the purely mechanical and technical skills in this particular sense, experience, technique, mechanics, I call that technical skill. Now that should be one of the main things that every caster is working on day and night, because it's incredibly important to have very high technical skill in that sense, because it will make you very good at all aspects of your job. In theory, that's the basis to be good at the other aspects. Now that's step number 1. Now in that area, Deman's one of the best we have. Now clearly, from seeing some of his old casts, some of it is natural ability. He probably had a natural edge in some sense, or was drawn in some sense to it because there was something about it made sense. But he's also worked on it a lot, and he's improved a lot in these certain areas, and he's self-reviewed, and he's managed to reflect on what he's done and improve, and he's become one of the best in a League of Legends context, and even in CSGO he's still pretty good because he can apply some of that technical skill just to CSGO without the other areas. Second area, game knowledge. This is the idea of how much do you know about the game, but not only that, it's how much do you know about how the game works. What models do you have in your mind to imprint over as a grid over the reality of the game, so that you can understand the way these things interact and principles and philosophies of what happens within the game. Because the reason why I bring that up is because clearly his knowledge is okay there, but it's not as good as some of the other people in the scene, and it's not as good in as much as that could be a hindrance point to his technical skill. His technical skill can get him so far, but the game knowledge in this sense could be an issue. The reason why I bring that up is because people, thinking back to the old school days, like I'm saying, of Red Eye and Tosspot when they were doing it 10 years ago, obviously those people have done CSGO since and they've improved. One of the issues that those sorts of people would have is, because back then you weren't required to have game knowledge as that sort of a play-by-play, people will even say, yeah, but as the play-by-play guy, you don't need game knowledge. I can tell you, as someone who's done a decent amount of colour commentary and has watched a lot of esports and sports commentary, you do need a pretty good base knowledge of the game and understanding who the players are and the principles of the game. Not so that you yourself can give analysis, because that's not going to be your job, but to know what analysis to ask for from this guy, to know how to create a space for him to do that analysis in, to know what sorts of things to say that he can then feed off and hook onto to say things himself. So you do need a pretty decent level, actually, in that sense. Now, I don't think Deman's is bad in that respect. His problem is he's just not at the level of the tier 1. In fact, that's one of the main things I'd stress about this video. His issue isn't that he's a bad caster in CSGO. He could definitely be a tier 2, tier 3 caster if he was just in a free market where he didn't work for ESL. He would do events and he'd maybe even work his way up to doing majors. But at the moment, he's not at the level of the Anderson Semlers of this world. And that's an issue for him as a caster because he's inserted to that level artificially by his company. And that's where I think a lot of this resentment and friction between him and the community comes from. And even then, I think that's overplayed, but we'll get to that. So in terms of game knowledge, I think he's decent, but he could improve in this particular respect. And that's something that might not even be from hard work, lack of hard work thereof. It might purely just be he hasn't been in the game long enough, hasn't had enough time, hasn't assimilated enough of the concepts. And that's another thing, just as a side point, I will mention. The reason why I was a little bit skeptical when he came in and he mentioned that he'd played those past FPS games is that one thing I really despise is people who come into CS and they say, right, well, I used to play CS, and CS is a simple game. You know, everyone knows the simple tactics for Dust 2. They're all the same for 10 years, and everyone can just play, and, you know, if you hit your shots, you win. That sort of caster, which I'm not saying Deman is, by the way, but it's just, I thought this is a good general point to bring up, which I've heard from other games who think that because they once played CS 10 years ago, they now know CS, is such bullshit. They don't, what happens is they are like the noob who only sees the surface of the game. They don't understand the deeper things behind the game. And they're actually being quite condescending by imagining CS is this simple game that they know the things to and the strategies don't evolve and these sorts of things. So I'm always on the lookout for people like that, and I will fuck them up if they ever come in and do that in this game and say anything along those lines. So that's not actually particularly relevant to D-Man, but it's just a general point that comes off the idea that if you'd done past games, you would naturally have a position here. Now, the last third category, and this is very important because Deman himself must understand this, but this to me is where he's also fallen down more so than any of the others, is your personal branding, or if you want to use it a different way, you could say your popularity. And what I mean by that is what people know about your identity as a CSGO caster, what they like about it, what qualities work within the context of a cast with other people. Your chemistry to some degree is going to come off this a little bit. In general, it's how much people like you, because the more that people like you, you might even have less technical skill, you might have less game knowledge, but if people really like you and they really dig your vibe and they know what your brand's about and they want you at events, then it's going to be very easy for you to be hired for events, stay at events and be very successful regardless of the other ones. And that might seem unfair. That's the point of all these categories. If people don't know all these categories, they might have phenomenal game knowledge and they'll go, oh, I should be a caster. Well, you couldn't be, mate, because if I put this random guy who on Twitter is an expert and knows all the details in front of a mic and a camera, he'll just fucking fall apart. You won't know what he's saying and he'll say stupid things and he'll make mistakes because he's not in a computer where he can look things up and just say things. Or if I put someone who has fantastic technical skill and okay game knowledge but no branding, no one knows who he is, he doesn't have a distinct personality, doesn't know how to mesh with other people in that sense, he's going to run into a lot of trouble and he won't be appreciated and it might take a long time to break through. So one of the big issues for me in this sense is that D-Man and ESL perhaps didn't even do that good a job in terms of branding him and building up his persona and building up the popularity. They just kind of hoped that if he just came into the game, came over from League of Legends, there'd be some carryover or people would see that he was working hard and they'd like it. But that's not how the branding and popularity has worked for anyone in CSGO. Aside from the very beginning when people like Red Eye and Joe Miller did some games, and because they were beloved of 1.6 and it was very recent in memory, everyone else has had to build their way up. Tosspot as well, I guess, has had to build their way up within CSGO. People like Anderson Semler started at the smallest levels. People like Yanko's coming in now as an observer, Moses, me, we all in theory started with smaller terms or further back in time to where our popularity and branding has only built up now, in some cases 6 months later, in some cases a year and a half later if we finally got to the reasonable level. So, I mean, there was kind of a a weird comment I actually found when I was looking through, I think it was on his Reddit, when I was looking through for some of these other comments, where I found some weird comment that said, CSGO casting is different. There are no true play-by-play casters, just mixed random variants of half play-by-play, half color, and then in brackets he puts Anders, Semler, DDK, James Bardolph, that the community has decided they are happy with. Then you just have a few pure color that work with them. However, almost every other traditional sport and esport uses one pure play-by-play and one pure color. Now, in theory, there's not that much to be read from this, but it just was an interesting comment because the way he said that, the community has decided they are happy with. Now, I'm not sure what emphasis he meant on that. I'd really like to hear him say it out loud because I don't know if that's supposed to mean like that this isn't as good a combo, because he does reference afterwards that traditional sports and even other esports use the pure play-by-play, the pure color. It almost sounds as though he's kind of making it seem like there's something weird or not that great about the fact that Anders and Semler, who to him are two half play-by-play, half color variants, which I don't even agree with, by the way, although I think in on both cases I'd edge them slightly more to the other one. I'd say they're like a quarter play-by-play, 3/4 half color, but on opposite ends of the spectrum. That's why I think they work well, because they can then mix together. Almost as though they've just decided they're happy with, as though this maybe isn't ideal. I don't know. That's just how I would read into that to some degree, or I'd wonder about the way it was phrased or the relevance of bringing it up. Just an interesting comment, because if that's underlying how he thought he would come into CSGO and be this pure play-by-play and it would impose the traditional structure, now you're seeing how there could be some issues here, or why, if he had anything to do with hiring people, he might think Anders and Semler aren't the ideal casting duo to have doing a major final. Just food for thought there. Now, in terms of him complaining after the fact, or being a bit upset or grumbling about the fact that maybe things haven't gone ideally in CSGO, there's still some resistance and blowback. First and foremost, as I mentioned, if you break down the three categories, purely within a CSGO context, he has some questionable aspects maybe on the knowledge stuff, maybe even purely just in terms of time spent in the game. And he certainly, in terms of the popularity and branding, can't be close to some of the tier one people I'm mentioning who people want to replace him. I mean, that's just the way it is right now. It might be possible one day to overtake them with a lot of hard work and applying yourself, but it's going to be difficult. Now, one of the interesting things is, how could he have made some inroads on this? Well, here's the problem. His catch-22 is the reason he's doing majors, and the reason he's in a prime position right now is because he works for ESL and he's a full-time ESL caster. But because he's a full-time ESL caster, he's not doing the smaller events on the circuit, or even the medium events, or even dream hacks. And because he's not doing those events, aside from ESL events, where the public even now kind of understands he's artificially inserted because they hire him at ESL, it means he doesn't have a chance to kind of prove himself or build up his brand elsewhere. If he could go and do a Star Ladder, or he could do one of the Face It events when there were smaller events, which they were earlier this year, or he could go and do an MLG or an ESA, whatever it might be, it'd be a way to get people familiar with him, to see him outside of an ESL context, so they don't feel like he's just being artificially given the job by some sort of nepotism or something, and they actually feel like he's earning his way up, and they get to know his casting style, and gradually you might be able to build a fan base that way. I think that would have been a way to do it. The problem is, obviously, that means you obviously wouldn't get inserted into the majors, so it is a catch-22 to some degree. Because what a great example of this is Toby One. So Toby One came into CSGO and initially was just doing events at Star Ladder, and I myself came out and said, like, sort of get the fuck out of this game, because I suspected he was only coming in because there's some mild issues in Dota 2 with some drama going on there with the International and Valve, and then also the fact that he seemed like a bit of a tourist in as much he was coming in, and I suspected he wasn't going to stick around for long. And then the fact that there was the first major was coming up made me questionable, like, is he staying in just to try and do the major and then see where it goes there? So part of the reason I said to fuck off is because I suspected he wouldn't stay around very long. Now what's funny is I was actually right. He didn't. He disappeared for like a year and a half. But here's the thing. When he came back and he started doing PGL, which was an online league in Romania. It wasn't even one of the biggest leagues. And he built up his own distinct personality within CSGO, even working with with Sadikist at the time. And he managed to get his own kind of hype going for him, and he did Gfinity Champion of Champions recently at EGX, and that seemed to go well. And in general, no one's trying to put him in the place of the tier 1 casters. He's not even doing CSGO full time in that sense. He's still in Dota 2, but he's got his own place, and people appreciate him and people like him, and I don't really see that much negative comments about him. So he has a place if he wants, and if he wanted to go full time in CSGO, he could, and he could build it up, and he could probably become tier 1 eventually. I don't see that's unreasonable. That's an example of a reasonable way to do it, where there's not going to be the kind of friction there. Now, it's also, I'm going to bring this up now, because it's something that's been in my mind ever since he came into CSGO. It's also just kind of a rich situation that Deman might be at all upset by the way he's been received in CSGO. Because when he was a full-time League of Legends caster and he was working for Riot, this situation happened. It was in, let me think. Actually, it was just after he'd quit. I think it was in December of 2014. And what happened was there was a discussion going on about people, newer casters being hired to like LCS and those types of Riot broadcasts. And what happened was one of the main people, who at least was the underlying current of the conversation, is Thorin, who was a fantastic commentator for Chinese League of Legends, who's a woman, and she'd done LPL, and she's someone who is definitely good enough to be an LCS caster. There are LCS casters right now, and were back then, who she is better than technically in game knowledge. And now the one area she didn't have was the popularity and branding. That's why I bring this whole topic up. And so I can understand why she wasn't hired, but if it was up to me, she would be. And I've always counseled her to work on that aspect more and try and get your identifiable brand make more sense and figure out how to win people over. Because unfortunately, the casting game is very much about being liked in that sense. It's less about those other aspects, even though those other aspects will elevate how good you are at the job. Now, in this particular sense, there was a debate going on, and Froskurin was trying to make the case that, there's no women who've been hired to LCS broadcasts as casters, and this debate was going on. And so Deman weighed in with a couple of comments, which are quite interesting in the context of what's happened now in CSGO. So here we go. So he says, to the women caster point, it is as pointed out on merit. Equality means competing with the males. Now, first of all, that's very interesting in the context of Deman in CSGO, because was he given major roles on merit? Not in CSGO. In League of Legends, yes. In general casting, yes. Not in CSGO. So he was given those roles not on merit and not with equality. He didn't go into the open circuit, play other tournaments, do other tournaments, build his name up, and then equally compete, whatever, in terms of the public perception or which companies want to hire you. In that sense, he didn't do that within CSGO. He did get a leg up. Then he says, name me one person that deserves to be in the current LCS. Now, obviously, at this point in time, people like me are thinking, well, Froskurin, she does, which Deman, for whatever reasons, doesn't agree with. Now, he says here, not being hired because you're a woman. I'm not sure what that actually means in that sense. It put be better than the current cast is simple. I mean, couldn't I apply the same logic to him now? If you've got a problem with the way you receive, just be better than the current cast is simple. Now, it's quite condescending, by the way, to say simple in that particular sense, because as I've kind of outlined, like figuring out people's perceptions and how to win them over is an incredibly difficult part of the world. That's why fucking politics is this massive industry and why certain people thrive there and certain people are destroyed even when they seem to have risen quite high. Then he says, well, that's not Riot. That's on the person. If you can't drive yourself, no one will. Well, again, who's driving you? Apparently you should be driving yourself. Not if you get enough opportunity. If the community loves you, drive yourself. So this is where it gets interesting, because here's where it's going to be good, okay? He says that in League of Legends, there are a lot more opportunities now, yet people expect to be given the chance, not earn it. Again, quite rich in the context of what's happening in CSGO. And then he mentions that I think it was him and Joe Miller, used to cast Go for LOL tournaments like a year before they did big lands. Now, first of all, that's a disingenuous comment in the context of League of Legends, because Go for LOL tournaments at the time were mainly all that existed. There weren't that many lands at the time. So actually Go for LOL tournaments, as people wouldn't know in the modern day, had TSM and CLG, the biggest teams, within them. So actually that's quite disingenuous, because if you casted Go for LOL tournaments in December 2014, you'd be casting no-namers, people who won't become stars for years maybe, and no big teams. So it's actually not in at all the same scenario where you could go now and cast Go for LOLs and it would be like this. You can't earn your way in the same exact way Deman did. You'd have to do it in a different method, and it is more limited now that the structure's set in place for League of Legends. So that's quite a ridiculous comment anyway. But the point is, and here's the last one, it says, if you don't know how to self-review, sure, but don't expect good feedback from Reddit, etc. Well, there we go. There's the crux of the problem, right? You're not getting good feedback. By your logic, just be better than them, simple. Don't expect good feedback if you don't self-review. Now, no one can know if he does these things, but also the implication that you have to earn your spot. You don't just get given your spot. Now, unfortunately, that's exactly what happened in CSGO. He was given a spot, which he had some merit for, coming from another game, and I can understand the potential. I mean, if I was the person at ESL who was in charge of hiring, I'd have given him a try of majors. I probably wouldn't have put him right in a final. I'd have put him in like quarterfinals, tested him out on certain group stage games. I'd have actually limited him to certain teams. You're going to cast this team's games during the event, so you can keep a track of it, and you can focus purely on researching them, and you're going to talk to these players. I'm going to try and pair you with these couple of people and see which synergy makes sense and build it up later. I would have done it that way. I think it was a bit more willy-nilly the way that ESL did it in terms of what I saw, but just an interesting thing. I thought I'd just bring that up because the contrast, it's not even that very far apart. It's only a few months apart from when he goes into CSGO. Now, in League of Legends, presumably, Deman understands that people want Joe and they want Riv, etc., over less well-known and less loved casters who might be just as good or might be close to as good or might be very good in their own right. But he can understand the political games played there, presumably. I mean, in CSGO, people to this day ask for Tosspot, and Tosspot, he will even tell you he doesn't watch most of the tournaments. He barely does it. He'll only do the odd tournament like he did earlier in the year, when the Twitch job that he has, his full-time job, allows him to be at the event and maybe do it. He doesn't even really do CSGO now. Likewise, in 2014, people, as Anderson Semler, were still establishing totally themselves, still used to ask for Red Eye, still used to ask for Joe Miller, even when those guys at the time didn't even fucking cast CSGO anymore and weren't even working in the game to a degree. Red Eye was in the industry, obviously, but he wasn't like working as a full-time caster. They were asking for them over people who are now more established names. Those people had to battle through that. Also, let's be real, the response wasn't overwhelmingly negative to Deman's casting. I mean, first of all, League of Legends fans, and I saw tons of them on the Global Offensive Reddit, were like, oh, loved him in League of Legends, can't wait to see what he does in CSGO, or really impressed. Loads of people were like, oh, so impressed that he's practicing, because if you remember after Katowice, the first major, he said something along the lines of like, he was going to try and practice cast every single game of the tournament so he could get his skills up, and he put a VOD of him practice casting. People were like, I'm so impressed with his dedication, he's going to be so good coming in. I know a lot of people were excited for this. His problem is, because he was artificially inserted into events and then contrasted with bigger names, for my money, that made him get lumped in with Pansy, Jason Kaplan, some of the other ESL-only employees who only work those events and themselves are clearly inserted in that way. And so he's lumped in with them. And so if people don't like them, they also associate that with Deman. And part of that is because he doesn't do other tournaments now. That's an issue that obviously has nothing to do with me. You've chosen the career you want. There's also the fact, and I just want to point this out, that if you read his Twitter, as I did when I was scrolling through to find some of these comments and some of these AMA things, he's known to be quite a pedantic guy himself. He's not the most easygoing guy always with other people in the industry or with other people generally who ask questions that he thinks are stupid. He can be quite caustic in terms of how he answers, or quite blunt and sharp, and he can be quite a pedantic guy himself. In fact, what's funny is, as I was looking through, in an AMA, he even said this: however, I also have a side from my mother, which is much more serious and argumentative at the slightest thing being wrong. You don't see this side on camera. And did a smiley face. Now, here's the thing. By the way, I have some of those qualities myself, so I can identify in that sense. I understand the way it is. But if you're going to be that way, to some degree, you have to be able to take it back a little bit. You know, if you're going to give it in that sense, you have to be able to take it as well. And if people do it, yeah, you can get mildly miffed or whatever, but you can't be like, oh, this shouldn't be happening. Why am I not being treated this great way? Okay, that's just the way things are, right? I mean, I've got some great examples of that. Like one person who, interesting, I hadn't noticed this that much, but when I was scrolling back, there's quite a few interactions where he just goes really, like out of nowhere, will just go in on Sir Scoots, who's obviously a legendary figure within the CSGO community. So there was an example where in August, Slasher had mentioned like the peak for CS, and then as the final was coming, Slasher made a comment saying like, maybe ESL's cameraman will even let us watch what's happening in the game for a final. Now Slasher knows very little about CS and presumably knows fuck all about production in CS, so he probably isn't in any position to talk about production and what the cameraman is or didn't do, but he's just given an amateur opinion, and he didn't like the way the cameraman was doing it, which apparently was Yanko was the spectator. Now what's interesting is D-Man answers Slasher initially and says two different camera guys. And Sir Scoots comes in. Sir Scoots, not only a legendary figure, but has worked many years in esports and in real life in production of huge TV features, knows a lot about what goes on behind the camera, and at Got Frag TV back in the day, let's think like 2007 sort of era, 2006, was doing production where they had very advanced production, where they had camera angles, multiple different ones that he could switch between like a real TV producer, so he could have all the player POVs and he could go to anywhere he wanted, and he could do a very advanced production that's actually better in some ways than what we have now in CSGO. So this guy, who's a legend and knows a lot about the industry, way more than Deman does about production, says about the two cameraman aspect, he just replies and says they should work the finals together with one supporting the other for cam angles. Now, he's not even making a criticism there. He's just saying if you have two camera guys, there's a way that if you make them both work on the final, like one could be setting up a camera angle, then you could switch over to him while the other one sets up a third person shot. He's making quite a good production point. D-Man comes in and just says, please point out a single mistake that Yank has made, assuming you actually looked at the spec's name. I mean, the point I'm making here is the way he addresses these things is not exactly the most amiable, get-along sort of guy. I mean, he's almost went out of his way to read some sort of weird insult or implication in a Scoots' comment there, which is actually quite a reasonable piece of advice. There's also the fact that when I looked through on Reddit for instances on him on the Global Offensive one, I saw tons. I mean, there was one that was like a comment with 400 upvotes, 400 points that said like, shout out to D-Man, your CS casting is bloody fantastic. I found a bunch of threads that were all really positive. Again, in terms of branding, what's interesting is I couldn't find a D-Man AMA thread. I mean, I'm not sure if there ever was one, but I couldn't find one on Global Offensive. Last one I could find was on League of Legends months and months ago. So that's another way you can build up how the community sees you, etc. So in general, I think it's a topic with a lot of nuance, a lot of complicated issues, and it's not as black as white as anyone is presenting. But to go back to the original point, I think people are going too far by making out like fuck Deman just because he said he regretted not doing League of Legends. I think that's kind of a bit unreasonable to interpret it that way. Anyway, thanks to Alphadraft for the cash. And this sick shirt, indirectly, if I chose to buy one. I didn't, but I might. So, get fucked.